In 1941, a whole military train carrying soldiers disappeared without a trace. It was erased from history, its men listed as missing in action, and their families left with only silence. Then, 75 years later, a young woman flying a drone over a dried-up lake makes a chilling discovery. Not just one train, but a massive pile of them, twisted together in the mud. And among the wreckage, a single rusted dog tag is found with her grandfather's name on it. But as she began to ask questions, she uncovered a terrifying secret that officials had buried for decades. A secret someone was willing to do anything to keep hidden. What happened to the men on that train, and why was their final destination a watery grave at the bottom of a lake? Subscribe. It helps these stories to reach people who lost hope and inspire them to keep seeking truth. And drop your city and local time in the comments. It's always fun to see our map light up. In the late summer of 2016, the air in Havenwood, Wisconsin, hung thick and still, heavy with the scent of pine and the faint, dusty smell of a earth that had forgotten rain. It was a season of unusual drought, a relentless sun having baked the land for months, pulling back the waters of Lost Creek Lake like a receding tide and exposing secrets the town had long since let drown. For Emily Carter, a high school history teacher from the city, it was just a quiet visit to her grandmother's house, a small, clapboard home that smelled of baked bread and lemon polish. She was a woman who lived in the past for a living, piecing together the grand narratives of nations from dusty textbooks, but she had never felt the pull of her own history with the same intensity. Her grandfather, a man she knew only from a single solemn photograph on the mantelpiece, was a ghost, a name listed as missing in action back in 1941, a story with no final chapter. To escape the sleepy rhythm of the small town, Emily had brought her drone, a sleek, four-propeller machine that was her window to a different world. She loved the feeling of lifting away from the ground, of seeing the familiar world shrink into patterns and textures. On this particular afternoon, she drove her late grandfather's old pickup truck to the edge of the now exposed lake bed. The view was startling, almost alien. The cracked mud stretched for nearly a mile, a mosaic of deep fissures that looked like a scar on the face of the earth. With a quiet hum, the drone lifted into the hazy sky, and the world below transformed on the small screen of her controller. She guided it out over the center of the former lake, watching the landscape unfold. From 100 feet up, the barren expanse was strangely beautiful. Then, her eyes caught something on the screen that didn't belong. It wasn't a rock formation or the shadow of a cloud. It was a shape, long and rigid, jutting from the mud at an unnatural angle. Curious, she lowered the drone, its camera zooming in. Her breath caught in her throat. It was the skeleton of a train car, its metal skin rusted to a deep, angry orange, its windows like vacant eye sockets staring at the sky. She felt a jolt of historical curiosity, the kind that always thrilled her in the classroom. A forgotten relic, a piece of local history swallowed by the water decades ago. But as she panned the camera left, the single train car became 2, then 4, then a dozen. It wasn't one train, it was a graveyard. A tangled, horrifying pile of them, crushed and mangled together, as if dropped from a great height. They were piled in a massive heap, some driven into each other with such force they had fused into a single, monstrous sculpture of decay. It was a scene of immense, silent violence, and it made no sense. Why would so many trains be here, in the middle of a lake? It looked like a mass grave for machines. She flew the drone closer, her heart hammering against her ribs, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. The scale of it was staggering, a catastrophe no one had ever spoken of. She recorded for nearly 20 minutes, circling the wreckage from every angle, capturing the haunting tableau before the drone's battery began to flash its warning. Back at her grandmother's kitchen table, the scent of fresh coffee did little to soothe the chill that had settled deep in her bones. The drone sat on the floor, its quiet whirring a stark contrast to the disturbing silence of the images on her laptop screen. Her grandmother, a gentle woman whose hands were rarely still, was knitting in the adjacent living room, the rhythmic click of her needles, a comforting metronome to Emily's unease. She replayed the footage, frame by frame, her teacher's mind racing to find a logical explanation. A massive derailment? A wartime scrap operation gone wrong? Nothing fit. The trains were military transport cars, she could now see, their faded markings just barely visible beneath the layers of rust and sediment. As she zoomed in on a particularly mangled section of the pile, a flicker of light caught her eye. It was tiny, almost imperceptible against the dull brown of the mud. She paused the video, magnifying the image until the pixels blurred. A glint of metal, half buried near the broken axle of an overturned car. It wasn't a piece of the train, it was something small, something personal. An inexplicable urge took hold of her. She had to know what it was. She called her cousin Mark, a man who had never lost his boyhood love for exploring forbidden places. An hour later, armed with rubber boots and a shovel, they were wading through the thick, clinging mud of the lake bed. The stench of decay and stagnant water was overwhelming. When they finally reached the spot she'd marked on her GPS, Mark carefully dug around the object. With a soft squelch, he pulled it free. It was a small metal disc on a broken chain, caked in 75 years of grime. Back in the truck, Emily washed it carefully with water from her canteen, her hands trembling. As the mud fell away, letters began to emerge. First an R, then a T, then an E. Her blood ran cold. She rubbed harder, her thumb tracing the familiar shape of the stamped letters until the name was clear, unmistakable. Sergeant Robert Carter, her grandfather. The drive back to her grandmother's house was a blur. Emily clutched the rusted dog tag in her hand, the cold metal feeling impossibly heavy, a tangible link to the man who had only ever been a story. The official report had been so clinical, so sterile. Sergeant Robert Carter, U.S. Army, went missing in action in the winter of 1941 during a troop transport. Presumed deceased. There was no body, no location, just a void her family had learned to live around. But he wasn't missing in a far-off land. He was here. He had been here all along, at the bottom of a lake less than 5 miles from the home where his wife waited for a letter that never came. She walked into the house in a daze, finding her mother, Ruth, had arrived for her weekly visit, sitting with Grandma Carter at the kitchen table. The sight of them, sharing tea and quiet conversation, felt like a scene from another lifetime. "Mom," Emily said, her voice shaking. "Grandma, I found something." She opened her palm, placing the dog tag on the worn wooden table. For a moment there was only silence. Her grandmother's knitting needles stopped clicking. She peered down, her faded blue eyes widening as she recognized the name. A soft, wounded sound escaped her lips, but it was Ruth's reaction that stunned Emily. Her mother stared at the dog tag as if it were a venomous snake. Her face, usually so composed, hardened into a mask of anger and fear. "Where did you get that?" she demanded, her voice sharp and low. Emily, still reeling from the shock, explained everything. The drone, the dried-up lake, the mountain of wrecked trains. As she spoke, the color drained from Ruth's face, replaced by a fierce, protective fury. "Put it back," she hissed, pushing the dog tag away from her. "Emily, for God's sake, just put it back where you found it. Some things are meant to be left alone." Emily stared at her, confused and hurt. "Left alone? Mom, this is Grandpa. He didn't disappear overseas. He's here. Don't you want to know what happened?" Ruth stood up so abruptly her chair scraped loudly against the floor. "No," she cried, her voice cracking with an emotion Emily had never heard from her before. "I don't. All it will do is bring up pain. Your grandmother has had enough pain for one lifetime. You have no idea what you're messing with. You need to stop this, right now." With that, she grabbed her purse and stormed out of the house, the screen door slamming behind her, leaving a profound and terrible silence in her wake. Emily felt as if she'd been slapped. She looked at her grandmother, who now held the dog tag in her frail, trembling hands, her eyes filled with a grief so old and deep it seemed bottomless. "She's just scared, child," her grandmother whispered, her voice raspy with unshed tears. "Scared of what the truth might cost us. Later that night, long after her grandmother had gone to bed, Emily sat alone in the living room, the dog tag resting on the open page of her grandfather's Bible. Her mother's anger echoed in her ears, a warning she couldn't heed. How could she stop now? This wasn't just a historical mystery anymore. It was the final, unwritten chapter of her own family's story. Her finger traced the words her grandfather had underlined in the Bible, a prayer his wife said he repeated every night, "And you will know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." The words felt like a promise, a calling. Her mother saw a buried wound, best left undisturbed. But Emily saw an injustice, a story violently silenced. The men on those trains, her grandfather among them, had been erased. Their families had been lied to. Holding the cold metal dog tag, she made a quiet vow to the ghost in the photograph on the mantelpiece. She would find out what happened in 1941. She would uncover why an entire military train, filled with soldiers, ended up at the bottom of a lake. She would give him, and all the others, their names back, no matter what secrets the town was hiding, and no matter who wanted them to stay buried. The truth would set them free. She just had to be brave enough to dig it up. The next morning, the sun rose over Havenwood with a deceptive warmth, casting long shadows that seemed to hold the chill of the night. Armed with her grandfather's dog tag and a historian's relentless curiosity, Emily began to walk the quiet streets of the town, seeking not records, but memories. She started at the local diner, a place where coffee was perpetually brewing and the town's elders gathered to trade stories like currency. She found 3 of them in a worn vinyl booth, their faces a roadmap of the town's history. When she carefully brought up the story of the wrecked trains, a knowing silence fell over the table. One of them, a man named old Mr. Abernathy, with eyes that had seen nearly 9 decades pass, finally stirred his coffee and spoke. He called it the ghost train. It was a local legend, a tale whispered to children on dark nights. He said that back in the winter of 1941, a whole troop train just vanished. One day it was scheduled to pass through the county on its way to a training base up north, and the next, it was gone. The old newspaper clippings, he recalled, were vague and thin, filled with official-sounding phrases like rerouted due to strategic necessity and lost to the fog of war. It was a loose thread in the town's tapestry, a story everyone knew but nobody understood. It was as if a train full of young men had rolled into a cloud and simply never come out the other side. Listening to them, Emily felt a surge of validation. This wasn't a delusion born from her personal grief. It was a real shared wound in the community's memory. Hope, bright and sharp, cut through her anxiety. If the story was real, the proof had to be somewhere. That hope propelled her to the Havenwood County Courthouse, a formidable stone building that smelled of old paper and floor wax. She felt a familiar thrill walking through its marble halls. This was her territory. Archives and records were the bones of history, and she knew how to read them. A friendly, silver-haired clerk behind a thick pane of glass listened to her request with genuine interest. Emily explained she was researching a local historical event from the early 1940s, a supposed military transport incident. She kept her explanation vague, not yet wanting to reveal the personal, explosive nature of her discovery. The clerk smiled warmly. "Of course," she said, her voice kind. "Records from that era are in the lower archives. It's a bit dusty, but you're welcome to look. I'll just need to get you the access key." It was a moment of pure, unadulterated triumph. This was it. The door was opening. She could feel the truth, just within reach, waiting for her in a forgotten file box. As the clerk turned to retrieve the key, a shadow fell over the counter. A man had approached, his presence so commanding it seemed to suck the air from the room. He was tall and impeccably dressed in a dark suit, his face sharp and impassive. A small pin on his lapel identified him. Deputy Commissioner Harris. He gave Emily a polite, empty smile that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Can I help you, miss?" he asked, his tone smooth as polished stone. The clerk hesitated, looking from Harris to Emily with a flicker of apprehension. Emily explained her request again, a new knot of unease tightening in her stomach. Harris listened without expression, his gaze unwavering. When she finished, he didn't even glance at the clerk. He spoke directly to Emily, his voice dropping to a low, confidential tone that was more intimidating than any shout. "I'm afraid those particular records are sealed," he said simply. Emily's heart sank. "Sealed? Why? They're over 75 years old." Harris's smile tightened. "Wartime transport logs often fall under federal jurisdiction. National security," he added. The words, a brick wall she had no hope of climbing. The justification felt flimsy, absurd, and that's what made it so terrifying. It was power for power's sake. "But it was a local incident," she pushed back, her voice betraying a hint of the desperation clawing at her. "Surely the county must have its own files." This time, he leaned in closer, the faint scent of expensive cologne doing little to mask the chilling finality of his next words. He looked her directly in the eye, and for the first time the polite mask slipped, revealing something hard and dangerous beneath. "Miss Carter," he said, the name sounding like a warning, "some things in this town are buried for a reason. I would advise you to let them stay that way." He held her gaze for a moment longer, a silent assertion of his authority, before turning and walking away without another word. The friendly clerk now looked at her with a mixture of pity and fear, quietly shaking her head. There would be no key. The door had been slammed shut and locked, not with a key but with a threat. Emily walked out of the courthouse into the bright sunlight, feeling defeated and furious. Harris's words echoed in her mind, "Buried for a reason." He wasn't just a bureaucrat enforcing a rule, he was a guardian of a secret, and he had just drawn a line in the sand. A wave of frustration washed over her. This was wrong. This was how history was erased, how truth was suffocated by men in suits citing rules that served no one but themselves. And in that moment, she made a decision, a risky, perhaps foolish decision born of anger and a desperate need to fight back. She couldn't get through the official door, so she would have to go around it. She would take the secret to the people. That evening was the monthly Havenwood Town meeting, held in the high school gymnasium. The air was thick with the smell of floor polish and stale coffee. Emily sat in the back, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She watched her neighbors, the same people she'd seen at the diner and the grocery store, file in and take their seats on the hard plastic chairs. When the floor was opened for public comment, she found herself walking to the microphone before she could talk herself out of it. Her hands were shaking as she gripped the stand. She looked out at the sea of faces, some curious, some bored, some openly suspicious. And she saw Deputy Commissioner Harris sitting in the front row with the town council, his expression unreadable. "My name is Emily Carter," she began, her voice steadier than she felt. "My grandfather was Sergeant Robert Carter." She paused, letting the name hang in the air. A few older residents murmured, recognizing the name. Then, she told them everything. She told them about the drone, the dried-up lake, and the horrifying pile of military trains. She told them about finding her grandfather's dog tag, proving that he and who knew how many other men didn't vanish overseas. They met their end right here, in Havenwood. As she spoke, a ripple of shock and disbelief spread through the room. But when she mentioned that the county records were sealed, and that Deputy Commissioner Harris had blocked her search, the atmosphere shifted. It became tense, uncomfortable. She had just publicly challenged one of the town's most powerful figures. When she finished, a heavy silence filled the gymnasium. Then, a man from the council stood up. "Young lady," he said, his tone condescending, "are you suggesting there's some kind of conspiracy here in Havenwood? That our own officials are hiding something?" Before she could answer, another voice called out from the crowd. "She's an outsider, stirring up trouble where it doesn't belong." The room erupted into a flurry of competing voices. Some were sympathetic, demanding answers, but many were hostile, their fear of upsetting the town's quiet order overriding their curiosity. They saw her not as a granddaughter seeking truth, but as a threat. They accused her of disrespecting veterans' memories, of trying to tarnish the town's name with wild accusations. She looked to the crowd for an ally, for a single face that understood, but all she saw was a community fracturing before her eyes, turning on itself and on her. Harris sat motionless through it all, watching her, a faint, knowing smirk on his lips. He didn't have to say a word. He had let the town do his work for him. Emily walked away from the microphone, her face burning with humiliation. She had gambled on the power of community, and she had lost. She had not only failed to rally support, she had made herself a public target, isolating herself completely. As she slipped out the side door into the cool night air, she felt the crushing weight of her failure. The lake held its secrets, the courthouse held its secrets, and now the town was closing ranks to keep them. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The days that followed the town meeting were suffocating. Emily felt the weight of 100 gazes every time she walked to the corner store, the whispers trailing behind her like a shroud. She had become a pariah, the city girl who came to stir up ghosts the town preferred to keep buried. Her mother, Ruth, called every day, her voice a tightrope of anxiety and disapproval, begging her to pack her bags, to come home, to let the past lie. Each call was a fresh wound, a reminder of the chasm that had opened between them. Defeat was a bitter taste in her mouth, and for 2 days she did nothing. She sat in her grandmother's quiet house, staring at the drone footage on her laptop, the mangled trains a silent testament to a truth no one wanted to hear. The humiliation of that public shaming burned hot in her chest, but beneath it a different fire was smoldering, a cold, hard rage. Harris had not just silenced her, he had turned her own community against her with masterful precision. He had made truth, seeking, seem like an act of aggression. And that, she decided, was an injustice she could not walk away from. If the front door to the truth was guarded by a man like Harris, she would have to find a back window. There was one place in town where knowledge wasn't currency and power didn't dictate access: the public library. More specifically, the person who ran it. Her name was Martha Klein, a retired librarian who still volunteered 3 days a week, a woman who seemed to have been born among dusty shelves. Emily remembered her from childhood visits, a quiet, meticulous woman with ink-stained fingers and glasses perched on the end of her nose. Martha lived for the forgotten corners of history, the stories tucked away in overlooked documents. She was an archivist of the town's soul. Emily found her in the library's basement, a cool, dry space that smelled of aging paper and leather binding. Martha was carefully repairing the spine of an old book, her movements precise and full of reverence. When Emily approached, Martha looked up, and for a moment, Emily expected to see the same guarded suspicion she saw on every other face in town. Instead, the librarian offered a small, knowing smile. "I was at the meeting, dear," Martha said softly, setting her tools aside. "They were wrong to treat you that way. Fear makes people cruel." A wave of relief so profound it nearly brought Emily to tears washed over her. An ally. She had found an ally. She sat down and told Martha everything. Not just the public story of the drone and the dog tag, but the threat from Harris, the cold official wall she had hit at the courthouse. Martha listened patiently, her expression growing more serious with every word. When Emily was done, the old librarian didn't offer platitudes or warnings. She simply stood up and said, "The county may have sealed the Army's records, but the railroad had its own. The two rarely spoke to each other, especially during the chaos of the war. If that train left the station, there would have been a freight ledger, a simple logbook. It wouldn't fall under national security." For the next 5 hours, the library basement became their command center. Martha, with an almost supernatural instinct, knew exactly where to look. They navigated a labyrinth of cardboard boxes and forgotten filing cabinets, a tomb of paper records that hadn't seen the light of day in decades. They sifted through mountains of shipping manifests, payroll documents, and maintenance logs. The work was tedious, the air thick with dust that made Emily's eyes water. Hope began to wane, replaced by the familiar ache of frustration. It felt like another dead end, but Martha was relentless. "Patience, dear," she would murmur, her fingers dancing across faded labels. "Paper always remembers." And then, In a heavy, leather-bound book tucked inside a mislabeled box for county tax receipts from 1952, they found it. The book was a freight ledger for the Tri-County Rail Line, winter 1941. Emily's heart hammered as they gently turned the brittle, yellowed pages. Her hands trembled as she scanned the columns of dates, train numbers, and destinations, all recorded in the elegant, looping cursive of a long-dead station master. There it was. December 4th, 1941. Troop Train 774. A single line item. The cargo was listed simply as U.S. Army personnel. And the destination, typed neatly in the corresponding column, was Fort McCoy, W.I. This was the official story, the training base up north that old Mr. Abernathy had mentioned. Emily felt a pang of disappointment. It seemed to confirm the official narrative, making the wreckage in the lake even more baffling. But Martha wasn't looking at the typed words. She was squinting at the far right margin of the page. "Look here," she whispered, her voice tight with excitement. Tucked away at the edge of the page, next to the entry for train 774, was a faint, almost illegible annotation, scribbled in a different colored ink, a rushed and hurried hand. It looked like an afterthought, or a secret correction. 2 words. Black Ridge. Emily stared at the words, a chill running down her spine. Black Ridge wasn't a military base. It wasn't even a town. It was the old local name for the strip of land that bordered Lost Creek Lake, the place where she had found the trains. The ledger held 2 stories. The official, typed destination for the eyes of the world, and the secret, handwritten truth for someone who knew where to look. The train wasn't lost. It wasn't rerouted. It was sent there. It was sent exactly where it was found. The lie was right there, bleeding through the page. The Army had lied. The reports had all been lies. Someone had deliberately sent those men to the edge of that lake and then buried the truth for 75 years. That evening, Emily sat with her grandmother in the soft glow of a table lamp, the house quiet except for the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hall. She explained what she had found in the ledger, her voice low and steady, trying to shield the older woman from the full shock of it. She expected tears or perhaps anger like her mother's. Instead, her grandmother simply closed her eyes, a look of profound, ancient sorrow settling over her features. She reached out and took Emily's hand, her skin as soft and thin as parchment. "Black Ridge," she repeated, the name a ghost on her lips. "I knew it." Emily looked at her, confused. "You knew? How?" Her grandmother was quiet for a long time, lost in a memory 75 years deep. When she finally spoke, her voice was a fragile whisper. "He had a song," she said. "Your grandfather. The last few weeks before he left, he was always humming it. It was a new tune, one I'd never heard before. It was a sad song, but he hummed it like he was trying to memorize it, like it was important." She paused, her eyes misting over. "I asked him what it was called. He just smiled that sad smile of his and said, 'It's the song they taught us for where we're going.' He never told me the name of the place. Just the song." She began to hum, a faint, melancholic melody that filled the small room with a chilling beauty. It was a tune of farewell, a melody heavy with resignation and loss. It was the sound of a man walking toward his own grave. The freight ledger had given Emily a fact, a location, but the song gave her the truth of the heart. Her grandfather, and likely all the other men on that train, knew they weren't going to a training base. They knew they were being sent somewhere they might not come back from. And they had been given a song to sing on the way. The melody hung in the air between Emily and her grandmother, a haunting echo across the decades, a new key to a door she was only just beginning to understand. The freight ledger had cracked the official story, but it hadn't explained the why. The haunting melody of her grandfather's last song filled the spaces where facts were missing, suggesting a grim foreknowledge, a resignation to a fate that had been deliberately concealed. Emily knew that paper records could only take her so far. This secret had been kept not just by documents but by people. It was a conspiracy of silence, and to break it, she needed to find a voice. Her thoughts turned to the places in a small town where secrets are kept, where whispers live longer than headlines. She thought of the church. The Havenwood Community Church stood on a small hill overlooking the town square, its white steeple a beacon of stability. Its pastor, a man named Whitaker, was known for his quiet compassion and his deep roots in the community. He had presided over the town's baptisms, weddings, and funerals for over 30 years. He was a keeper of stories, both sacred and profane. Emily found him in the church basement, sorting through boxes of donated clothing. The air was cool and smelled of mothballs and old hymnals. Pastor Whitaker was a gentle, soft-spoken man, and like Martha Klein, his eyes held no judgment, only a patient curiosity. Emily, emboldened by her recent discovery, laid out the story for him, showing him a photo of the freight ledger on her phone. She watched his face carefully as she spoke, and she saw it, a flicker of recognition, a shadow of an old memory stirring behind his kind eyes. When she finished, the pastor sat down heavily on a wooden folding chair, the weight of his thoughts seeming to press him down. He was quiet for a long time, his gaze distant. "I was just a boy," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I remember the talk. My father and some of the other men, all of them veterans from the Great War, they used to gather here in this basement to play cards. They thought I was too young to understand what they were saying." He looked at Emily, and the kindness in his eyes was now mingled with a deep, ancient guilt. "I heard them talking about the train, about your grandfather's train. They said the men on it were sealed in." Emily's blood ran cold. "Sealed in? What does that mean?" Pastor Whitaker shook his head, the memory clearly painful. "The doors. They said the army had bolted the train car doors shut from the outside. Not just locked, bolted. They said it wasn't a transport. It was a cage. The image was horrifying, suffocating. A train full of men trapped in metal boxes, rumbling toward an unknown destination. A cage on wheels. "But why?" Emily pressed, her voice trembling. "Why would they do that?" The pastor's next words landed like a physical blow. "I don't know why," he admitted, "but the men I overheard, they mentioned a name. A man in town who helped organize it, who made sure no one asked any questions. He was a powerful man. Everyone respected him. He was the mayor at the time, Mayor Abernathy." Emily stared at him, her mind reeling. Mayor Abernathy, the friendly old man from the diner, the one who had told her the legend of the ghost train. It couldn't be the same person. No, that was old Mr. Abernathy," she corrected him. "The man at the diner." Pastor Whitaker gave her a sad, weary look. "I'm talking about his father, dear, the town's beloved former mayor, the man they named the library after." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The entire structure of the town's benevolent history, the narrative of good, honest people, began to crumble. A trusted figure, a man celebrated as a founding father, had been complicit in sending a trainload of soldiers to their deaths. The conspiracy wasn't just some faceless military order from Washington. It was rooted right here, in the soil of Havenwood. The people who were supposed to protect the town had been the ones who betrayed it. Armed with this devastating new piece of the puzzle, Emily felt a renewed sense of urgency. Eyewitnesses. There had to be someone still alive who saw something, who wasn't part of the cover-up. She spent the next 2 days tracking down the oldest residents in the county, men and women in their late 90s, their memories clouded by time. She found a handful who had vague recollections of military activity near the lake that winter, but their stories were fragmented, unreliable. Yet 2 of them, a brother and sister living in a nursing home, remembered the same specific chilling detail. They recalled seeing flatbed trucks, army trucks, driving toward Black Ridge day and night for about a week, but they were all empty on the way out. And they both remembered the sound. A terrible metallic screeching sound that echoed across the valley at night, a sound that made the dogs in town howl. She felt she was on the verge of a breakthrough. She had corroborating testimony. It was thin, but it was a start. She decided to go back to the brother and sister to record their official testimony. But when she arrived at the nursing home, she was met by a stern-faced nurse who informed her that the family had requested they receive no more visitors. They were suddenly too frail to speak. Confused and suspicious, she drove to the home of another potential witness, a man who had claimed to have worked on the rail line that winter. When she knocked on the door, his son answered, his face pale and strained. He told her his father had had a change of heart and wouldn't be speaking to her anymore. It didn't make sense. One by one, her sources were drying up, their doors closing in her face. The hope she had felt just days ago was curdling into paranoia. It felt coordinated. It felt like someone was walking behind her, erasing her footsteps. The true, terrifying answer came the next morning. She was at the school where she taught, 2 hours away in the city, preparing her lesson plans for the coming semester. Her principal called her into his office, his expression grave. Sitting in a chair opposite his desk, looking perfectly calm and composed, was Deputy Commissioner Harris. A cold dread, sharp and acidic, flooded Emily's stomach. He wasn't in uniform. He was wearing the same impeccable dark suit he'd worn at the courthouse. He smiled that same empty smile. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice dangerously pleasant. "I was just in the city for a meeting and thought I'd stop by. I understand you're on a temporary contract here at the school." He let the words hang in the air, a perfectly crafted, unspoken threat. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse her of anything. He simply reminded her of her vulnerability, of the power he held not just in Havenwood, but beyond. He was telling her that his reach was long, and that if she continued digging, the consequences would be quiet, professional, and devastating. Her teaching contract, her career, her entire life, could simply not be renewed. She felt a surge of defiant anger, a desire to scream at him, to expose him right there in the principal's office. But she looked at her principal's worried face, at the institution she loved, and she saw the web he was weaving. A public fight would accomplish nothing but her own professional ruin. She left the meeting feeling violated and powerless, the metallic taste of fear in her mouth. Harris was no longer just an obstacle. He was a predator, patiently circling, and he had just shown her his teeth. The hunt was no longer just for the truth. It was now for her own survival. The veiled threat from Harris left Emily shaken to her core. It was one thing to be met with bureaucratic stonewalling and public scorn. It was another entirely to have a man in a position of power follow you 2 hours away to threaten your livelihood. The fear he had intended to instill in her took root, cold and sharp. For a full day she did nothing, paralyzed by a feeling of profound helplessness. She thought about her teaching career, the one thing in her life that felt truly hers, and the idea of it being quietly snuffed out filled her with a sick dread. He had shown her that the battle wasn't just for a historical truth, it was for her future. She felt the urge to pack her bags, to heed her mother's desperate pleas, and run back to the safety of her quiet, orderly life. The risk was too great, the enemy too powerful, the walls too high. But then, she looked at the faded photograph of her grandfather on the mantelpiece, at his young, hopeful face, frozen in time before he was loaded onto a train and sealed inside. She thought of the whispers Pastor Whitaker had shared, of a beloved mayor who was a betrayer, of a town's foundation built on a monstrous lie. Walking away now felt like a second betrayal, another act of burying the dead under a comfortable silence. The fear was real, but the thought of living with the cowardice of walking away was worse. She wouldn't be bullied into silence. She would just have to be smarter. Harris controlled the people and the paper. What he didn't control was the physical evidence still sitting at the bottom of the dried-up lake. The first drone footage was compelling, but it was just an overview. She needed more. She needed proof so undeniable that it couldn't be dismissed as a local legend or the wild theory of a troublemaking outsider. She needed close-ups, details, something that could be seen on the 6 o'clock news and understood in an instant. She called the only person in Havenwood she still trusted to have her back without question, her cousin, Mark. He was a mechanic, a man who understood engines and systems, and more importantly, he had a stubborn streak that rivaled her own. He had been furious about what happened at the town meeting and had been itching for a way to fight back. When Emily told him her plan, a slow, determined grin spread across his face. "About time we rattled the cage," he said. They decided to go at dusk. The failing light would provide cover, and the summer heat would have bled from the day, making the trek across the cracked mud more bearable. As the sun began to dip below the tree line, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, they drove out to the lake bed in Mark's beat-up truck, the drone case sitting between them like a briefcase full of secrets. The air was still and quiet, the silence of the place amplified by the vast, empty expanse. The mangled pile of trains was a dark, skeletal shape in the twilight, a monument to a forgotten atrocity. Emily's hands were steady as she prepped the drone. This time there was no sense of wonder or discovery, only a grim determination. The small machine whirred to life and ascended into the deepening gloom, its small green and red lights blinking like malevolent eyes in the darkness. Mark stood beside her, a powerful flashlight in his hand, ready to act as a lookout. Emily expertly guided the drone back toward the wreckage, her eyes glued to the screen of the controller. She brought it lower this time, skimming just feet above the rusted metal carcasses. The camera's lens pierced through the shadows, revealing details she had missed before. She saw the thick, rusted bolts driven through the outside of a sliding door, just as Pastor Whitaker had described. She saw remnants of torn fabric, caught on jagged edges of metal, the last vestiges of the uniforms the men had worn. The sheer violence of the scene was even more visceral up close. It was a tomb, and she was its first witness in 75 years. Suddenly, the live feed on her controller flickered. For a split second, the image dissolved into a shower of static before snapping back. "Signal's getting weak," she muttered, her focus absolute. She tried to pull the drone back, to lift it higher, but it wasn't responding. The controls felt sluggish, disconnected. The screen flickered again, more violently this time, and then went completely black. "No, no, no!" Emily cried out, frantically working the control sticks. "I've lost it! I've lost the connection!" Mark swung his flashlight beam toward the wreckage. They could hear the drone's high-pitched whirring turn into a sputtering, dying whine. It careened sideways, clipping the edge of a rusted train car with a sickening crunch of plastic and metal before tumbling out of sight into the dark recesses of the wreckage. Silence. A profound, crushing silence descended on the lake bed. Emily stared at the black screen in her hands, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. All that proof, all that irrefutable evidence was gone, lost in the very tomb she was trying to expose. "The signal was perfect just a second ago," Mark said, his voice laced with suspicion. "It's a clear night. There's no interference out here. That wasn't an accident." He was right. It felt deliberate, surgical. Someone had knocked their eyes out of the sky. A frantic, desperate scramble followed. They plunged into the wreckage, using the flashlight to navigate the treacherous, twisted metal. After nearly an hour of searching, Mark spotted it. The drone was shattered. One of its propeller arms snapped clean off, but the central housing containing the memory card was miraculously intact. A surge of triumphant relief shot through Emily. They had it. They had the footage. They quickly retreated back to the truck, their initial elation giving way to a new, more immediate fear. They were exposed. Someone knew they were here. Someone was watching. The drive back to her grandmother's house was tense and silent, every pair of headlights in the rearview mirror feeling like a threat. When they were finally safe inside, they plugged the memory card into Emily's laptop, their shoulders pressed together as they huddled over the small screen. The last moments of the footage were chaotic, a jarring tumble of rusted metal and dark sky, but the minutes before the crash were crystal clear, a damning high-definition tour of a mass grave. It was more than enough. It was everything. Emily felt a wave of hope, so powerful it almost made her dizzy. This was the weapon she needed. This was the truth that Harris couldn't seal away in a dusty file. Exhausted but wired with adrenaline, She decided to drive back to her apartment in the city that night. She couldn't risk staying in Havenwood. Not now. It was after midnight when she said goodbye to Mark and slid into the driver's seat of her car. She turned the key in the ignition. Nothing, just a weak, clicking sound. She tried again. Click, click, click. The engine was dead. A cold finger of dread traced its way down her spine. Coincidence was a luxury she could no longer afford to believe in. The next morning, she called a local mechanic to come take a look. An hour later, he was standing in her grandmother's driveway, wiping grease from his hands with a rag, his face pale and grim. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and serious, "your starter's fine. Your battery's fine. But you're lucky you didn't try to get a jump start." He led her to the front of the car and pointed down into the engine block with a shaky finger. "Someone cut your brake line. Cut it clean through. If you had managed to get this car started and pulled out onto the highway, you wouldn't have stopped until you hit a tree." The world around Emily seemed to go silent. The cheerful birdsong, the distant hum of traffic, it all faded away, replaced by the roaring in her ears. This was no longer a veiled threat about her job. This was no longer about intimidation. The rules had changed. They weren't just trying to silence her anymore. They were trying to kill her. The mechanic's words hung in the air, thick and poisonous. A cut brake line. It was such a crude, brutally simple act of violence, a clear and undeniable escalation. The line between intimidation and murder had been crossed. Emily stood staring at the severed tube in her car's engine, and for the first time, a pure, paralyzing terror washed over her, colder and deeper than anything she had felt before. Harris wasn't just a corrupt bureaucrat. He was a man willing to kill to protect his secrets. Or he was working with someone who was. She didn't go to the police. How could she? The entire power structure of the town seemed to bend around Harris. Filing a report would be like handing her enemy a list of her own weaknesses. It would be dismissed as a mechanical failure, or worse, as another one of her hysterical ploys to stir up trouble. She was trapped, a rat in a maze designed by a predator who knew her every move. The weight of it all was crushing. The freight ledger, the drone footage on the memory card, it all felt useless now. What good was evidence if you were dead? She spent the next 2 days inside her grandmother's house, the curtains drawn, jumping at every unfamiliar sound. She felt like a prisoner, not of walls, but of her own fear. The vow she had made to her grandfather's memory felt like a naive, foolish boast. The truth wouldn't set her free. It was going to get her killed. On the third morning, as she was listlessly stirring a cup of coffee she had no intention of drinking, the mail slot rattled. It was an unusual time for the mail. She cautiously approached the door and peered through the peephole. The street was empty. On the floor was a single plain white envelope. There was no stamp, no return address. Her name was typed on the front. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. It felt thin, almost weightless. Inside was a single folded sheet of brittle, yellowed paper. As she unfolded it, she saw it was a letter. The ink faded to a ghostly brown, the cursive elegant but rushed. It was dated December 3rd, 1941. The night before the train disappeared. It began, "Dearest Sarah." The letter was from a soldier, a young man on the train, written to his sister. He wrote of the cold, of the grim quiet that had fallen over the men as they were loaded into the train cars. He wrote of their confusion, how none of the officers would tell them their true destination, only that it was a mission of the highest national importance. And then came the line that made Emily's breath catch in her throat, a line so chilling it seemed to radiate a coldness from the fragile paper itself. "The sergeant came through an hour ago," he had written. "He didn't say much, just looked at us with a kind of pity in his eyes. He told us to write our letters home. He told us they told him we'd never see home again." It was a voice from the grave, a direct, first-hand account of the betrayal. These men knew. They were told they were being sent on a one-way trip. This wasn't a tragic accident. It was a premeditated sacrifice. At the bottom of the envelope was a small, separate note, written in the same typed font as her name. It read, "He was a good man. He deserves the truth. Be careful." There was no signature. It was a lifeline thrown from the shadows, a confirmation from an unknown ally that she was not crazy, that this monstrous truth was real. Who could have sent it? A descendant of the soldier? Someone from the church? Or maybe even someone from inside the town's silent conspiracy, an individual finally suffocating under the weight of a 75-year-old guilt. It didn't matter. The letter was a thunderclap, a piece of evidence so profoundly human and emotional it transcended any dry official document. This was the heart of the story. This was proof of the crime. She immediately took the letter to Martha Klein at the library. The old librarian's hands shook as she held the delicate paper, her face a mixture of awe and horror. With the help of a local historian Martha trusted, a man who lived 2 towns over and had no ties to Havenwood's politics, they verified the handwriting against old enlistment records. It was a match. The letter was genuine. But as Emily examined it more closely with the historian, they discovered something even more disturbing. A small detail in the letter's closing lines. The soldier wrote, "The mood is strange. The men from the other trains are just as scared as we are." The other trains, plural. Emily's mind flashed back to the drone footage, to the sheer scale of the wreckage. It wasn't one train. It was a massive, tangled heap of them. This wasn't a single, isolated incident. It was a systematic operation. They weren't just burying one troop transport, they were hiding a much larger, darker secret. The lake wasn't just a grave for train 774, it was potentially a mass grave for a whole series of them, filled with men conscripted for what the soldier had vaguely referred to in his letter as secret projects. The scope of the cover-up was staggering, far bigger than she had ever imagined. The letter, this single piece of paper, had transformed the entire investigation. Empowered by this undeniable proof and fueled by a righteous, reckless anger, Emily made another flawed, impulsive decision. Her fear had been replaced by a burning need for confrontation, for justice. She could no longer play a quiet game of chess with Harris. She had to flip the board over. She found him at the town square, presiding over the annual Founders' Day Planning Committee meeting. He was in his element, the respected public servant, projecting an aura of calm authority. Emily marched right up to the front of the gathering, the letter clutched in her hand. She didn't wait for permission to speak. "Deputy Commissioner Harris," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that cut through the polite chatter. The crowd of volunteers fell silent, turning to stare at her. Harris's polite smile never wavered, but a flicker of something cold and dangerous sparked in his eyes. He had not expected this. Not here, not in public. "I have a letter," Emily announced, holding it up for everyone to see. "It was written by a soldier on the train your town helped disappear in 1941. She proceeded to read the most damning lines aloud, her voice trembling with emotion but unwavering in its purpose. The words echoed across the quiet square, painting a horrifying picture of betrayal and sacrifice. "They told us we'd never see home again." When she finished, a shocked, horrified silence fell over the small crowd. They stared from the letter to Harris, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning suspicion. For a single beautiful moment, Emily felt a surge of triumph. She had him. She had exposed him in front of his own people. But she had underestimated her opponent. Harris didn't flinch. He didn't deny it. Instead, he did something far more insidious. He stood up, his expression one of deep, paternal disappointment. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice laced with a carefully manufactured sadness, "we are all sympathetic to your family's loss. But to take the private letter of a fallen soldier and twist his words into a public spectacle, it is a profound disrespect to the memory of all veterans." He turned his gaze to the crowd, his face a mask of solemn duty. "This young woman, in her grief, has become an agitator. She seeks to tarnish the honor of the brave men who served this town, our fathers and grandfathers, by painting them as conspirators. This is not about truth. This is about desecrating their memory for her own selfish crusade." He was a master puppeteer. With a few perfectly chosen words, he transformed her into the villain. He reframed her search for justice as an attack on their heritage, on their families. The crowd's expressions began to shift. Suspicion turned to resentment. Resentment hardened into anger, directed not at him but at her. The whispers started again, but this time they were louder, sharper. "She's disrespecting the dead. Who does she think she is?" Emily stood there, the letter feeling as useless as a feather in a hurricane. She had handed him a sword, and he had brilliantly, cruelly turned it back on her. The community didn't just turn against her, they rallied around the man who was lying to them. He was their protector, their leader, and she was the unhinged outsider trying to tear them all down. She had played her most powerful card, and in doing so, had lost everything. The fallout from the public confrontation was swift and brutal. Emily wasn't just an outsider anymore. She was a pariah, a declared enemy of the town's sacred history. Harris's masterful manipulation had cemented her status as a threat, and the community's fear and resentment hardened into a wall of impenetrable hostility. People now openly glared at her on the street. Old Mr. Abernathy, who had once shared the legend of the ghost train with a grandfatherly warmth, now turned his back when he saw her coming. It was a public shaming, orchestrated to perfection. Emily retreated to the suffocating quiet of her grandmother's house, the sting of her strategic blunder a constant, burning humiliation. She had possessed the truth, a soldier's dying words, and had wielded it like a club, only to watch her opponent deftly turn it into a shield. Hope, once a roaring fire in her chest, had dwindled to a few fading embers. She was out of leads, out of allies, and most importantly, out of time. A new, more insidious threat had appeared, not with a bang, but with the dry rustle of official paperwork. A notice appeared in the local paper, a small, unassuming block of text that most residents would have skimmed right over. The Havenwood County Water Commission had officially approved an accelerated plan for ecological restoration. They were going to reflood Lost Creek Lake. The project was scheduled to begin in less than 2 weeks. Emily felt the blood drain from her face as she read the article. It was a death sentence for the truth. Harris was moving his final chess piece into place. He couldn't remove the wreckage, so he was simply going to rebury it, this time under 1 billion gallons of water and an official seal of environmental progress. Once the waters returned, the trains would be gone forever, their secrets submerged so deep no drone could ever find them again. The timing was too perfect to be a coincidence. It was a direct response to her actions, a final, bureaucratic middle finger. A panic, cold and desperate, began to set in. She tried to fight it, to rally what little support she had left. She called a town meeting of her own, posting flyers on every telephone pole and community bulletin board she could find. She pleaded with people to see what was happening, to understand that the reflooding was a deliberate act of destroying evidence. Only 7 people showed up. Martha Klein, Pastor Whitaker, her cousin Mark, and 4 other elderly residents who were more confused than convinced. The rest of the town, convinced by Harris that she was a threat to their heritage, stayed away. The fear Harris had cultivated was stronger than any truth she could offer. Her supporters were too few, their voices too quiet. Defeat was no longer a possibility. It felt like a certainty, a great dark wave rushing in to drown everything. That night, as a storm gathered on the horizon, mirroring the tempest in her own soul, Emily sat at the kitchen table, the recovered memory card from her crashed drone in her hand. This was it. The last piece of tangible evidence she had. The last visual proof of the crime scene before it was washed away. But the footage was shaky, dark, and incomplete. It wasn't the smoking gun she needed. It was a hint, a suggestion, but it wasn't enough to force the world outside of Havenwood to pay attention. Staring at the tiny piece of plastic, a new plan began to form, a plan born not of strategy or hope, but of pure, undiluted desperation. It was reckless, dangerous, and almost certainly illegal. If they were going to flood the lake, she would go back one last time, but not for an overview. She needed something specific, something personal, something that could not be denied. Her first drone had spotted a glint of metal that turned out to be her grandfather's dog tag. How many more were down there, scattered in the mud like forgotten seeds? A name is just a name, but a dog tag is a man. She went to Mark, laying out her wild, last-ditch plan. His face was grim. The area around the lake bed was no longer just an empty field. The county had put up temporary fencing and signs declaring it a restricted construction site. There were security patrols. Getting caught wouldn't just mean a fine for trespassing. Harris would ensure she faced the harshest possible charges. He would paint her as a saboteur, a criminal, and destroy her credibility forever. But Mark saw the look in her eyes, the ragged edge of a fighter with nothing left to lose. "All right," he said, his voice low. "If we're going to do this, we do it right, and we do it tonight." They waited until well after 2 in the morning, when the town was asleep and the storm was beginning to break, the rumble of distant thunder providing a soundtrack for their mission. Dressed in dark clothing, they cut a small hole in the chain-link fence and slipped onto the site, their feet sinking into the soft mud. The air was electric, charged with ozone and their own pounding adrenaline. This time they had a new drone, a more advanced model Mark had borrowed from a friend, equipped with a better low-light camera and a longer-lasting battery. The wind was picking up, making flying a risky proposition, but it also masked the sound of the drone's whirring propellers. Emily's hands, slick with sweat, moved with practiced precision as she launched the small aircraft into the turbulent sky. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she guided it out over the wreckage, fighting the gusts of wind that threatened to send it tumbling. On the controller's screen, the scene below was a chaotic landscape of shadows and sharp angles. "What are we looking for?" Mark whispered, his eyes scanning the perimeter for any sign of the security patrol. "Glints," Emily whispered back, her focus absolute. "Anything that shines, anything that isn't rust or mud." For nearly 40 agonizing minutes, she scanned the wreckage, section by section. The battery indicator on her controller was already blinking, its life being eaten away by the fight against the wind. It was hopeless. The area was too vast, the details too small. Then, a flicker. A tiny, almost imperceptible reflection caught in the drone's light. It was near the crushed doorway of a train car that was half buried in the mud. She carefully maneuvered the drone closer, lowering it until it was hovering just a few feet from the target. The image on the screen sharpened. It was a dog tag, then another and another. A whole cluster of them, tangled together in a shallow pool of stagnant water, as if they'd fallen from the pockets of men scrambling over one another. This was it, irrefutable. The video was recording, capturing the names, the proof of the lives that had been extinguished in this very spot. Suddenly, a pair of headlights sliced through the darkness at the edge of the site, a security truck making its rounds. Mark grabbed her arm. "They're coming. We have to go, now." But Emily couldn't pull away. The drone was still recording, capturing the most important evidence she had ever found. "Just 10 more seconds," she breathed, trying to get a wider shot to establish the location of the tags within the larger wreckage. The truck's engine grew louder. The beam of its spotlight began to sweep across the lakebed, getting closer and closer. "Emily, now!" Mark hissed, pulling her insistently. With a final, agonizing glance at the screen, she hit the return-to-home button and began running, stumbling through the thick mud as Mark pulled her toward the fence. They scrambled through the hole just as the security spotlight swept over the spot where they had been standing seconds before. They lay flat in a ditch on the other side of the road, their lungs burning, their bodies covered in mud, as the truck slowly drove past. Emily was shaking, not from the cold, but from the sheer electrifying terror of the near miss. But clutched in her hand was the controller, and safe inside the drone now hiding in the bushes was the memory card. She had been nearly caught, but she was no longer just a granddaughter with a personal quest. She was a witness, and she had the evidence to prove the crime. Back in the fragile safety of her grandmother's house, the adrenaline from their narrow escape gave way to a surge of fierce, triumphant energy. The memory card was a tiny bombshell, and Emily knew she had only one chance to detonate it correctly. She couldn't go to the local news. Harris had too much influence in the regional media. She couldn't go to the state police. Harris would tie her up in jurisdictional red tape until the lake was reflooded and her evidence was worthless. She had to go bigger. She had to bypass Havenwood and everyone in it and take her story straight to a level of authority that Harris couldn't control. She spent the entire night researching, her fingers flying across her keyboard. She wasn't just looking for a news outlet. She was looking for an advocate. She found one in the form of the National Veterans Legacy Foundation, a nonprofit watchdog group based in Washington, D.C., known for its relentless pursuit of military cold cases and government cover-ups. They were famously aggressive, media-savvy, and had a reputation for making powerful people profoundly uncomfortable. They were perfect. With a hand that was surprisingly steady, she composed an email. She kept it concise and professional, a history teacher presenting her thesis. She laid out the facts: the disappearance of Train 774, the discovery of the wreckage, the sealed records, the freight ledger, and the soldier's letter. And then she attached the video file from the night before. She hit send, and for a moment, the only sound in the room was the frantic beating of her own heart. She had just fired her last and only shot. Now all she could do was wait. The response came faster than she could have ever dreamed. Less than 6 hours later, her phone rang. The caller ID was a Washington, D.C. number. It was a senior investigator from the Foundation, a woman with a sharp, no-nonsense voice named Sarah Jenkins. Jenkins didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Miss Carter," she said, her tone a mix of professional skepticism and barely concealed excitement, "we've reviewed your file. The footage is compelling. We're sending a team." The words were the most beautiful sound Emily had ever heard. It was happening. Someone believed her. Someone with power. The next 72 hours were a blur of activity. The Foundation's involvement acted as a shield. Suddenly, Emily was no longer a lone agitator. She was a key witness in a national investigation. A small team of journalists and investigators affiliated with the Foundation descended on Havenwood, their presence creating a stir that even Harris couldn't immediately quash. They interviewed Emily, Martha Klein, and Pastor Whitaker, documenting every piece of the puzzle she had so painstakingly assembled. The story broke on a Tuesday evening. It wasn't a local news segment tucked away after the weather report. It was the lead story on a national evening news broadcast. The footage Emily had risked her life for was suddenly being beamed into millions of homes across the country. There it was, in stark, high-definition clarity. The mangled heap of trains, the bolted doors, and the haunting, undeniable image of a cluster of dog tags glinting in the mud. The story was a firestorm. The phones at the Foundation, at the news network, and at the Pentagon began to ring off the hook. Outrage poured in from veterans groups, from families of soldiers long thought missing, from ordinary citizens horrified by the decades-long deception. The secret of Havenwood was a secret no more. Emily watched the broadcast from her grandmother's living room, tears streaming down her face. It was a moment of overwhelming vindication. The truth was finally out, roaring into the light. But just as she allowed herself a moment of relief, a moment to believe she had won, the beast she had cornered chose to strike back, and with a ferocity she never saw coming. The next morning, a uniformed sheriff's deputy arrived at her grandmother's door. He served her with a court order. It was a temporary injunction, filed by the county and signed by a local judge. It legally barred her from speaking any further about the case, from sharing any more evidence, and from entering the lakebed site, all pending a formal investigation into what the document called her illegal and unpatriotic activities. The language was pure Harris. He was branding her a criminal. He had twisted her desperate act of truth, seeking into a crime, accusing her of trespassing on a restricted site, of illegally filming a sensitive area, and, most cruelly, of engaging in acts of domestic agitation designed to undermine public trust in our nation's military and elected officials. The injunction came with a clear threat. If she violated it, she would be arrested. He had found a way to silence her again, this time using the full, crushing weight of the law. He couldn't kill the story now that it was out, but he could cage the storyteller. The villain was on the ropes, but he had nearly won, locking her down, discrediting her in her own town's legal system while the world watched. The victory that had felt so absolute just hours before now felt fragile, hollow. A profound despair, darker than any she had felt before, settled over her. She had won the battle for public opinion, but was about to lose the war on legal grounds. She could be arrested, prosecuted, and her entire testimony thrown into question. She felt utterly exhausted, defeated down to her very soul. That evening, seeking a final, quiet moment of connection, she drove to the town cemetery. There was no body, of course, but there was a small, simple headstone for her grandfather, erected by her grandmother years ago as a place to lay flowers and say prayers. It was a marker for a ghost. She knelt in the damp grass, tracing the cold, carved letters of his name. All this for him. And it had all come to this, a legal document branding her a traitor to the very memory she was trying to honor. The weight of her failure was suffocating. Just as she was about to give in to the tears, she felt a gentle hand on her shoulder. She looked up to see her grandmother standing behind her, her face etched with a love and a strength that seemed to radiate from within. Her grandmother didn't say a word about the court order, or Harris, or the town. She just knelt beside Emily, her old bones creaking, and took her hand. "You brought him home, child," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion held back for 75 years. "For all these years he was just a name on a list, lost in the fog, but you found him. You gave him back to us. Don't you dare stop now." In that moment, surrounded by the silent stones of the dead, her grandmother's words were a resurrection. They breathed life back into Emily's fighting spirit, extinguishing the despair with a single powerful flame of love and purpose. Harris could threaten her, the town could hate her, and the law could try to silence her, but they could not take this away. They could not take away the truth she had given back to her family. The battle was not over. It had just begun. The national firestorm Emily ignited could not be contained by a small-town court order. While Harris had successfully gagged her locally, he had lost control of the larger narrative. The pressure from Washington, fueled by relentless media coverage and the ferocious advocacy of the Veterans Legacy Foundation, became a force of nature that Havenwood could not withstand. The Pentagon, facing a public relations nightmare, was forced to act. Within a week, the county's flimsy injunction was superseded by a federal order. The plan to reflood the lake was indefinitely halted. In its place, a new operation was announced, a full-scale excavation and recovery mission, to be led by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. The lake was about to give back its dead. Heavy machinery, satellite trucks, and teams of forensic anthropologists descended on Havenwood, transforming the quiet town into the epicenter of a national reckoning. The chain-link fence that had once been a barrier to keep Emily out now became a barrier to keep the world's media at a respectful distance. For weeks, the town held its breath as the methodical, grim work of unearthing the truth began. Emily watched from a distance, her gag order still technically in place, but her heart was a mix of vindication and a deep, sorrowful dread for what they would find. The truth, when it was finally pieced together from the wreckage and from declassified documents that the Foundation had pried from the government's grip, was colder and more clinical than Emily could have ever imagined. The trains, as the soldier's letter had hinted, were part of a series of covert, high-risk experiments in the winter of 1941. With the nation on the brink of a world war, the military was secretly testing new types of chemical and radiological weapons in remote locations. The soldiers on those trains, many of them conscripted men deemed expendable or those who had been disciplinary problems, were the human subjects. They were being transported to a remote testing site in the northern woods of Wisconsin. But something went catastrophically wrong. Whether it was an accidental detonation, A chemical leak, or a deliberate act of sabotage was lost to history, but the result was a disaster of such magnitude that the only conceivable response was to erase it. Under the cover of wartime secrecy, a decision was made at the highest levels. The trains, with the bodies of the dead still sealed inside, were rerouted to the nearest disposable location, the deep, remote waters of Lost Creek Lake. They were systematically pushed off the rail line that ran along Black Ridge and sent crashing into the water, one after another, a horrifying, efficient burial at the hands of their own government. The operation was then scrubbed from all official records. The men were listed as missing in action, their fates scattered to the winds of a world at war, their families given a lie to live with for the rest of their lives. With the truth laid bare, the final pillar of the cover-up began to crumble. Deputy Commissioner Harris. Investigators, digging into the newly unsealed town archives, uncovered a direct link. Harris's grandfather had been a senior partner in the construction company that held the lucrative military contract to build the rail spur to Black Ridge and to assist in the disposal operation. The Abernathy family, the beloved mayoral dynasty, had been the local architects of the cover-up, profiting from the project and then spending the next 75 years ensuring its secrets were kept. Deputy Commissioner Harris wasn't just protecting a vague notion of the town's honor, he was protecting his own family's legacy, a legacy built on blood money and a monstrous secret. The evidence was irrefutable. Facing federal indictment for obstruction of justice and suppression of federal records, Harris resigned in disgrace. He didn't leave town in a defiant rage, but slipped away in the dead of night, his reign of quiet terror ending with a coward's whimper. Justice, at last, had been served. The day the army began returning the recovered dog tags to the families of the fallen, the town held a memorial service in the square. It was a somber, beautiful autumn afternoon. The crowd that gathered was not the hostile, divided mob that had condemned Emily. It was a community humbled, heartbroken, and finally beginning to heal. Hundreds of people were there, descendants of the lost soldiers who had traveled from all over the country, their faces a mixture of grief and gratitude. Emily stood at a podium, not as an agitator but as the voice that had finally broken the silence. In her hand was not the court order that had tried to gag her, but a copy of the soldier's letter. Her voice, clear and steady, carried across the silent crowd as she read his final haunting words. When she came to the last line, she looked out at the faces before her, at her mother weeping softly in the front row, at her grandmother, whose tired eyes shone with a peaceful, painful closure. "And you will know the truth," Emily read, her voice ringing with the power of her grandfather's prayer. "And the truth shall set you free." After the ceremony, she went home with her family. The house was quiet, filled with a sense of profound, exhausted peace. Emily took her grandfather's recovered dog tag, cleaned and polished now, its letters shining, and placed it gently on the mantelpiece, right next to his photograph. For 75 years, the photo had been a symbol of a question, a painful void. Now, next to the small piece of metal that had lain with him in the dark, it was an answer. The story had its final chapter. The lake had been a place of secrets and lies, a watery tomb designed to enforce forgetting. But through the relentless fight of one woman who refused to let the past lie, it had become a place of remembrance. The families who had spent a lifetime wondering now had a place to grieve. The town of Havenwood, once united in its denial, was now united in its mourning, beginning the long, slow process of healing a wound they had never known they had. The truth hadn't been easy. It had cost relationships, reputations, and nearly a life. But as Emily looked at her grandfather's face, she knew that every painful step had been worth it. She had not only brought him home, she had brought home an entire train of forgotten souls, freeing them, and her town, at last,